Hi students, Mrs. T here, and this is week 7 of sociology, so we are coming up to midterm at the end of this week. Check Blackboard for the announcements about the schedule you can expect for the midterm exam that will be available some point on Thursday. Not sure when on Thursday, but at some point on Thursday it'll be live in our Blackboard course content. And it's due Monday of next week at midnight. Now there is more in the announcement than just that little blurb, but please check your college email and also your Blackboard announcements for more details. Okay, so today in our short video, and I'm going to try to keep it under 30 minutes, and if I do another video, I'm going to try to keep that one under 30 minutes, so you can watch them earlier in the week. Yes, we have a quiz. Yes, we have a reaction paper this week on the usual days, due at the usual times, but at the end of this week, we've got that midterm I mentioned. So we're in the middle of Chapter 6. And Chapter 6 is on deviance and crime, and so we have a lot to talk about. We introduced deviance in the most recent video that was posted during week 6, so we know in general what it means in sociology. However, we did not look at deviance and crime specifically, or criminal deviance, like we mentioned was part of how we sociologists study deviant behavior. Okay, so we're going to look at crime, which represents disorder. It represents a type of deviance that goes against the law, which is, of course, laws are a type of norm, remember, so any behavior that goes against norms in a society is considered deviance. So specifically, crimes go against laws, which are that third type of deviance, and that is considered to be disorderly for society. So you have like shows on TV called Law and Order, for instance, crime versus order. Order in society is something that maintains stability, it maintains peace, and it is supposed to maintain equality. Because laws are supposed to be written in a fair way that treat everyone equally and give everybody a fair shot. At least that's the way our country, the United States of America, is designed. I heard a very good lecture about the Electoral College over the weekend, and it was talking about how the Electoral College actually elects the president so that big concentrations of people, like in Los Angeles or Chicago or New York, can't be the only people who elect the president. The president has to represent everybody across the United States. It's set up that way so that it's supposed to bring about equality and other things in a constitutional republic, like the United States is designed to be, is supposed to establish equal representation under the law. So that's what's supposed to happen, and so let's look at crime, but then also how categories of crimes are defined in different ways, and the sanctions for those crimes if you are found guilty of them, how those sanctions are designed to be a deterrent. Maybe they are not deterrents, but they're designed supposedly to be deterrents. And then we'll look at a current event that all of you, I'm sure, have heard about, the defund the police movement, and we'll do this from a functionalist perspective. We'll look at defund the police from a functionalist perspective, and we will look at defund the police from a conflict perspective. So macro issues associated with the defund the police social movement. Remember, in a most recent video or lecture, if you were able to be present for it in class, we talked about how deviance is a necessary part of order and stability in society, because not every generation has the same personality or needs as the previous generation, so change has to be part of social order, and deviance is a significant mechanism, it's a significant tool in order to bring about social change. We probably talked about the civil rights era and how sit-ins and protests and boycotts and all of those collective movements, those collective behaviors associated with protest brought about significant social changes. From a functionalist perspective, the functionalists would say, hey, those changes were necessary to maintain stability and order in the new generation of people who demanded it. They needed that for peace. moving forward. So that was a change that had to happen. Conflict theorists would say that the civil rights era brought about changes that had to happen because things were so terribly unequal before, and the civil rights era made great steps toward restructuring macro-scale society so that things could be on the way to greater equality in the future. Nobody would claim, no conflict theorist that I know of would claim that the civil rights legislation that happened in the 1960s fixed everything, certainly not in the hearts and minds of everyone in the nation, but it certainly restructured the law and order system so that those who might not behave in moral or ethical ways in relationship to others who had differences, those who would allow the negative side of their ethnocentrism to cause them to treat individuals differently on the basis of differences that were perceivable. The laws were put in place so that you couldn't get away with that anymore, essentially. Didn't necessarily mean that it changed the mindset of everybody in society. That kind of change happens much more gradually than some sort of legislative action in government. So let's look at deviance and crime versus order in society, and types of crimes and the sanctions that go with them. So let me erase this for a moment. Here's a good time for you to pause or to rewind and mark the counter number on the video so you know where to go and start over again. But let's talk about categories of crime. Okay? So there are some crimes that are considered property crimes. That's where someone is, and I'm not going to give you a definition for this. You should be used to that by now. You can look it up in your textbook or even ask Siri, what is the classification of a property crime? Property crimes essentially deprive someone of their valuables. It deprives someone of the ownership of certain things or the full benefit of ownership of certain things. But it does not endanger your person. Your physical self is not in danger. So for instance, if I come out to my car in the parking lot and my windows are broken out and stuff is stolen out of my car, I'm deprived of the stuff that's stolen out of my car, and I'm also deprived of the full benefit of my car because you've broken my window. Not you, somebody, right, has broken my window. So my car is damaged or vandalized, so to speak. Vandalism is certainly a property crime. And also my items were stolen out of it, so I've been deprived of that property. But I was inside shopping, I was inside teaching, I was inside doing whatever I was inside doing. I didn't witness it. My physical being was not threatened during the course of committing this crime. And therefore, the crime that I just described to you is considered a property crime. Things like burglary, vandalism, those kinds of things are property crime. Property was destroyed or damaged, but the owner of that was not endangered physically at the time. So make sure that you have that classification clear in your notes, but here's what I'm going to write down about the property crime. Yes, there is a victim or victims, plural, and yes, there is a perpetrator. I'm going to abbreviate that word like they do on TV. So yes, there was a perpetrator or perpetrators, but the victim was not present when the perpetrator committed the crime. So the victim was harmed because the property was taken, but their life or their physical well-being was not endangered. On the other hand, there is another type of crime that sometimes goes hand in hand with property crimes, and that's called a violent crime. So I mentioned an example of property crime over here is burglary. Burglary is a type of property crime. An example of a violent crime is robbery. A violent crime takes place when the victim is present. Victim is present. And the perpetrator endangers the life or well-being, physical well-being of the victim. So Robbery is a crime that takes property away from a person, a perpetrator or perpetrators, takes property away from a person, but the person who is victimized was present. So if I was at a stop sign and somebody jerked me out of my car and jumped in my car and drove off, then that is a violent crime. Yes, I was deprived of my property, but I was also assaulted and endangered in the process. So violent crimes tend to have higher penalties, higher sanctions associated with them than property crimes do. Property crimes have high sanctions, but if you did not endanger a person's life, then typically you don't have life sentences and things like that that you hear about for violent crimes, certain types of violent crimes that are committed and the individual is found guilty in a court of law for these things. So keep in mind property crime in particular for the story that I'm going to tell you here in just a little bit. Because, as a matter of fact, let me erase just this violent crime one over here, and let me give you another example of a category of crime that I'm going to talk about, and that's corporate crime. And while you're reading about corporate crime, you will hear about a particular type called white-collar crime. I can't write on the whiteboard today. White-collar crime is a type of corporate crime, and this white-collar word is particularly interesting when we talk about achieved statuses. And we will talk a lot about 3 particular achieved statuses in Chapter 7 when we reconvene after the midterm exam. You might remember what those 3 statuses are because I emphasized them so heavily when we first learned about them a couple of lectures ago. But the three achieved statuses that I'm thinking about are income, occupation, and education level. So income, occupation, and education level are particularly important as master statuses in the USA. So in the USA, we have, and we'll talk a lot more about this, like I said, in Chapter 7, but we have some distinctions of different types of jobs. The occupation that somebody holds is so important for the prestige or level of social respect that a person holds in society that we have 2 different distinctions for types of jobs. One is called a white-collar job. Again, I'm not writing on the whiteboard correctly. A white-collar job. And another is called a blue-collar job. Now, you might have heard of these distinctions before, white-collar and blue-collar. If you haven't, let me tell you what the significance for these things are, or what the significance is. Pardon me, don't tell Miss Dudley that I don't have my subject-verb conjugation correct. Okay, so white-collar jobs are jobs where your education level is high enough to get you the type of occupation so that you can work in an office building where typically you have to wear nicer clothing, and you get certainly a higher income level if you're able to get a job like that, which requires a higher education in order to get that occupation. So you see how there's always a link between those 3 achieved statuses that I'm just going to hammer it into you between now and the end of the semester. So a white-collar job is typically considered to be a professional job, a desk job. White-collar has a masculine association with it also, so it's kind of a sexist term too. Not only is it an elitist term because your education level has to be high enough to get that type of occupation that gives you that kind of income, but typically it's men who wear suits and ties that have the white collar, and that's where this word comes from, this distinction comes from. So this is kind of an elitist and also masculine bias to this term. This word has a masculine bias also. Blue-collar jobs are occupations that do not require higher education. Sometimes they might require a certification, so your education level, you might be able to apprentice on the job and learn how to do something. Maybe it would benefit you to get a certificate at a community and technical college like where we go, UAPTC. A certification could help you ensure a job or get you special skills, but you don't have to have a college degree. And the blue collar refers to the kind of uniform that people wear, which usually has like a little name tag on it, Bob or something, right? So you have a specialized skill, perhaps, or even not so much do you have a specialized skill yet, because maybe you're going into a field where you can learn on the job and work your way up. So a blue collar job, again, we've got an overlap of education, occupation, and income. Your education level is lower. You don't have to have formal education typically to do a blue collar job. It might help if you have a certificate from a formal education institution, but not usually required. So your education level gives you that occupation. That occupation doesn't have as much social prestige typically as, say, bank president or some other white-collar job. But the blue-collar jobs have a certain income level that can fluctuate, really. I mean, there are some plumbers and electricians who make more than attorneys do in a single year, but that's one of the reasons why we combine those three: occupation, education, and income. We combine those three into a master status called socioeconomic level because it's not all about just your income. Income for certain blue-collar jobs can be very high, but the social respect associated with them is typically not as high as jobs that require a higher education level. It's very complicated. But all of that I am telling you because we're going to bring the white collar discussion. By the way, blue collar also has a male connotation. There's another type of job that we're going to look at in Chapter 7 called a pink collar job. And guess who that's talking about, folks? We'll talk about more in Chapter 7. So back to crime. There's a certain type of corporate crime called white collar. So this is a crime of opportunity that people with higher education for the particular job that's required and a higher income to begin with, it's a crime of opportunity that you're only able to do if you hold certain occupations within society. So keep that in mind, especially when you're thinking of a social inequality kind of situation and the difference between the sanctions for property crimes compared to the sanctions for corporate crimes. So there's other types of corporate crimes too. Here we're talking about things like embezzlement or money laundering, those kinds of things. Typically, white-collar crimes are crimes of opportunity. You don't have access to the kinds of security clearances or accounts or the certain upper level offices in the office building where data is kept unless you have a higher level of education that gives you that occupation, which comes along with that income level. So corporate crimes are not really open to the population of the United States at large, whereas property crimes are, like anybody. I don't care who you are. You can be a billionaire's kid and steal somebody's backpack. A property crime, any of us can do. Corporate crimes, though, let's ask ourselves this. Can anybody do them? Or is it really only those who have access to the kinds of jobs that open the door for this kind of deviant behavior to happen? So there might be some inequality that we can observe here if we zoom out and look at things from a macro scale. So I've got a really old example that I think works really, really well for this comparison. Some of you might have newer examples that I could modify when I'm telling my students, since this example is like 20 years old and y'all weren't even born yet to a certain extent. Not all of you were. But let me tell you this story. So there was a property crime that happened about 20 years ago, and I remember it well because security cameras weren't very common way back in the day, 20 years ago. But This one particular store had security cameras, and they were kind of choppy pictures, but it caught everything on camera and it recorded it. And they provided the recording to the TV stations around town so that they could replay the images and try to catch the folks that did this. There were a couple of kids. I'm going to call them kids because they were like 22, 19, 21, 22, somewhere in that range, and that's a kid to me. And they were bored on a Saturday night, and they were walking down the street and saw some keys in somebody's van that they had left in the street, parked in the street legally. But they saw their keys and they thought, let's drive this van around. That'll be better than walking. And so the dumb kids jump in this van and drive the van off. So they've stolen a car. That's a huge property crime. That's like way in the felony range of property crime. But it didn't stop there. That wasn't the part that was caught on tape. They got bored after a while just driving around and decided it would be really nice to have some beer and cigarettes. So they drove the van through the side of a really popular liquor store that was on University Avenue at the time. And that's where the camera caught them. They scurried over the van and threw bricks out of the way so they could run in and grab as much beer and cigarettes as they possibly could. And it caught everything on tape. And it ran on channel 11 and 7 and 4 over and over again until the kids were caught. And they were caught, and there were victims, multiple. Whoever owned the building and the inventory in the van, all of these people were victims. Nobody's physical person was damaged because nobody was home or present at the time. But there were two perpetrators that did all this. That's a lot of value. I don't know how much money, maybe $100,000 worth of value that these kids damaged. And when they went to court, they got their day in court. They had a public defender, that was a weird slip, public defender, not public offender, assigned. And if I remember correctly, the oldest one got like 10 years and the youngest one got like 4 years or something, and the one who was driving got 10 years. And so they went to prison for a period of time. They got parole well before their sentences were up. But that kind of crime, this property crime, goes on your record forever. They were 19 and 22 in that age range. You were an adult when you did this. And it's going to follow them for the rest of their life. It has followed them for the rest of their lives. Not only can they not vote, can they not legally own a firearm, can they not do certain things that constitutionally the rest of us are allowed to do as our civil rights, but there are many jobs, those blue collar and white collar jobs that I was just talking about, there are many professions who will not let those kids go into that profession because they have that felony record in their background. And some of you right now are hearing me say this and you're like, oh yeah, I know this profession and this profession. We can't allow, or we couldn't get into this profession because so-and-so did this crime or whatever. So there are a whole bunch of problems, or how do I put this? There are a whole bunch of issues that a perpetrator, when found guilty and convicted, that a perpetrator has to deal with well past the sentence that's imposed on them. So it's not just do the crime, do the time, commit the crime, do the time, whatever the phrase is. If I do the time and I'm out, I'm not really out. I'm a prisoner the rest of my life because my liberty to be in society is significantly curtailed or shrunken, so that I have to live within the confines of what I did back when I was 19 for the whole rest of my life. So property crimes, nobody was hurt physically, but they caused quite a lot of damage, and they got sentences, and they're in their 40s, maybe 50s now, and they're still living with that. So their entire family structure has paid for it also because they've been limited on their professions that they were able to do. They're limited on the places where they can apply for rent, to rent an apartment. All kinds of freedoms and liberties that you and I take for granted, they are now limited for the rest of their lives. because of that stupid thing they did on a Saturday night 25 years ago, however long ago it was. Let me tell you the rest of this story. It goes over into the corporate crime category. During the same time, it was like within a year from each other, so this was like fresh on my mind when I heard the news about this. There was a very popular figure in Arkansas who was the president of the University of Central Arkansas for a while. And he was really popular in the media, and he was offered a bonus by the Board of Trustees at the University of Central Arkansas if he achieved certain benchmarks, built buildings or got funding from different corporate places, this kind of thing. So he was offered this incentive if he performed at a certain rate. But he committed a crime of opportunity. Because he was the president of the college, he had signature authority on all of the college's bank accounts, including the one that was holding his money for him in case he achieved these benchmarks that the board wanted him to achieve. And he thought to himself one day, I'm just going to write myself this check. I'm going to achieve these benchmarks. I don't need to wait for this money until whenever, 2 years or whatever the deadline was. I'm going to go ahead and just get it now. And so he did. There were victims. All of the taxpayers in Arkansas, your parents, if they lived here at that time and paid taxes, were victims of his, since it was a publicly run institution on public money. So all of those people were victims of his. I can't remember how much it was. It was something like $200,000, maybe more. But so they found out about it, that he had been dishonest with this money, and they fired him. And he was arrested for a corporate crime. And he didn't do a single night in jail, and since it was a corporate crime, it goes to a different kind of criminal court that has to do with federal issues. And he did not have just a regular old public defender assigned, because he was in a white-collar job that had a really high income level. So he was able to hire really, really experienced people from out of state and bring them in. And they devoted all of their time to his case, a team of people. And he was convicted of the crime. There was blood on his hands, so to speak, a trail of evidence that led right back to him. He was convicted of the crime, but he was fined and he was sentenced to probation. So I don't remember how long the probation was. He was really raked through the coals in the media, and probably terribly embarrassed. I'm sure he suffered a lot of hardship and strife at home. If he had lots of luxuries, he probably had to sell a lot of them because he was out of work and he had a big fine to pay and he had to pay back the money. But about 10 years ago, there was a story in the newspaper here in Arkansas to say, oh, y'all remember this guy from 20 years ago? He's in Florida now, working for another university. Not the chancellor or the president of the university, but he was working for another university at a really high-level position that's probably 3 times the salary that I make as your instructor. So I ask you to make a comparison about his life was certainly damaged. He probably suffered the loss of a lot of property. He was horribly embarrassed. He probably lost a lot of friendships. Maybe even his home life suffered. I have no idea whether he still has the same spouse or not, for instance. But all he had to do was move a couple of states away. And he's working in the same industry. He's working in a very similar role in the same industry that got him in trouble in the first place. So sanctions are written by those in power. Crime and criminal definitions, the criminal code, is written by people in power, people who have power to influence society and to set rules. And so even though any person, from the billionaire's kid to you and me, any person can commit a property crime. Can all of us, do all of us have opportunities to commit this kind of crime? My answer is no. I mean, I would have to really deeply, look further into this so that I understand every kind of thing. Maybe I'm in the position right now to commit something that falls underneath this category. I'm not looking for it, but this kind of category of crime, the person who is able to commit this typically has a higher access, security clearance, and trust within a corporate structure that the typical people like you and me don't. And when you look at the way sanctions are imposed and do not follow you for the rest of your life, compared to sanctions that are imposed and do follow you for the rest of your life, you can see a vast difference between the haves versus the have-nots over here. Because if you are a have-not and you commit a property crime, you probably will get a public defender who is not dedicated solely to your case. They mean well, they do their job the best they can, but they're spread thin and they can't spend 24/7 focusing on just you. And probably you're not going to get off as well as someone who commits this kind of crime. At least that's been the history of the haves versus the have-nots regarding the way crime and the criminal code is written in this country. So I will stop the video here because this is kind of long enough for this video right now, and we're going to talk in the next video about the defund the police movement and look at functionalism and conflict theory, because remember, these are just 2 points of view that you can look at any issue in society and evaluate it. You are gonna come to a different conclusion based on whatever issue you're looking at, but you can look from a functionalist point of view or a conflict point of view at the defund the police movement, and that's what we're gonna do next in the next video. So I will see you soon.